Lying on the surface, letting sunlight fade, heart rate dropping down.
I'm Tom Way, a freediver chasing a question. What happens when CO₂ rises, and how can we train to adapt? I'm not a podcaster, just someone trying to learn one conversation at a time. Today I'm speaking with Martin McPhilimey, a breath scientist and founder of the School of Breath Science. Martin's research looks at how breathing affects performance, recovery and health, and he brings a refreshingly evidence-based perspective to a field that's often full of hype. I'd like to welcome Martin, and you're going to have to pronounce your surname for me. Is it McPhilimey or McPhilimey?
Perfect. Bang on. You got it for first time. Trust your intuition.
Yeah. And to this conversation on carbon dioxide, Martin's not a free diver himself, but he's a scientist specializing in a lot of connected areas, especially in breathing science and breath work. He's the founder of the School of Breath Science. And I think I'll hand over to you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and your background.
Sure, yeah. I am a level 1 freediver, but yeah, that's about as far as I got.
I've actually seen some clips of you freediving, yeah.
Yeah, so I enjoy it recreationally, but I live in Western Australia, so I'm a bit scared of the sharks out here, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The first ever time I went out of my, one of the first guys I met here, he was a keen freediver. He's a freediver instructor, and he's a Spiro, and so he lives up in Exmouth, and we went out to 3 Mile Reef, which is just literally out off my coast here. And the first time I ever went spearfishing, he's like, come up, and I was like, what's that? He's like, there's a shark. He's like, just thought I'd let you know there's a shark. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'm going to go back to the boat. And I put my head up, and the boat was a good kilometre away. And I'm like, I'm going to go in because I don't want to be out here. There's a shark out here. And so he was like, okay, well, do you mind taking the bag of fish back? I was just like, wow, my first time ever out on a spearfishing is with a bag of fish, with knowing there's a shark there, and I've got to swim back a kilometres back to my boat for the first time ever doing it. So yeah, that was my introduction in Western Australia.
Are you actually based in Exmouth, or that's just where you
No,
happened to
I'm
be
not.
at the time?
Yeah, no. So he was in Perth, but he's moved to Exmouth now. He wants to live the life of living up there. So
yeah, because I think there's fewer great whites up there. I know there's tiger sharks and stuff up there.
Tiger sharks, and yeah,
beautiful.
But there's, I mean, yeah, Ningaloo Reef is the hidden gem in Australia. Everyone goes over to obviously Great Barrier Reef, but I would say if you're a true water person, freediver, or some people just love, you've got to go to Ningaloo Reef. And sharing that on this podcast will help those guys find somewhere special, because it's incredible. And you can see whale sharks up there. You can see everything. You can see, all different types of sharks. And it's just, there's so much feed for them as well. They're not aggressive because they're all fed. And so it's a pretty good space to go. Yeah.
It's high on my bucket list. In fact, it was my final destination 25 years ago when I left England. I had one of those 1-year young persons working visas for Australia, and the plan was to get there and then hopefully make a life there. But I stopped in Indonesia on the way, and I've never been to Australia. I never made it. I fell in love with Indonesia. I ended up stuck there. But that West Coast area, especially a little bit further south, is even more scary with bigger sharks, right?
Yeah. I don't typically go in the water too much down in Margaret River or down that south. Anyway, the introduction. So I got into respiratory physiology probably in 2009. And I did my master's degree on looking at how we can use inspiratory muscle training to train a diaphragm to improve lactate recovery following high intensity exercise. And so I also dived into looking at inflammatory markers during breathing, and we managed to mimic what it would like to breathe during exercise for an hour at 60% of maximum by using metronomes, by using end-tidal and carbon dioxide, by using esophageal balloon pressures, so swallowing a balloon down into the stomach to measure the diaphragm force. Really, really advanced stuff. And if I'm honest with you, in 2009, I didn't really have a clue what I was on about. I didn't know what I was doing. Luckily, I had a guy who was supporting me, a PhD student, and 2 professors that were supporting me. But that was my entry into, you could say, respiratory physiology, but coming from an exercise physiologist background. And then I actually trained as a clinical respiratory and sleep scientist. And so I trained in the NHS, and I worked for 3 years in Nottingham, then worked for about 6 months in London. And I was working with sick people. Very, very sick people in massive institutional hospitals, lots of research going on. Went through a scientist training program, trained to be a highly specialized scientist in respiratory and sleep. And then I moved to Australia. I moved to Australia in 2016, and I moved to a small private clinic here in Perth. And so you can probably imagine the difference between being in London at St Bart's Hospital to then being a private clinic in Western Australia where no one goes. There was a massive change in the role that I was playing and going from working with very sick people to working with people who had lots of symptoms, but probably weren't dying. You know, they were the worried well, you could call them. And what I just noticed over and over again, like most of their issues were coming from stress, nervous system dysregulation, you know, dysfunctional breathing, and, you know, there were medically unexplained symptoms. And I was like, look, the doctors are saying, you know, go home, you're okay. You're probably stressed or anxious, go and see a psychologist. And so I saw a gap that could help people to learn about their physiology and how it interacts with the psychology, you know, the mind-body connection. And obviously the breath is at the center of that, and just helping people to understand that process and then coaching people through practices. And I drawed from obviously things like oxygen advantage initially, my clinical background, free diving itself, yoga, pulled from all different areas and created like a short program that was like 8 weeks long. That was my initial program. And I just kept getting amazing results with like people who had breathlessness for years and years and years, people who had been anxious or stressed, helping manage those symptoms within a space of 8 weeks through breathing, through nervous system, through sleep education, through, you know, understanding their emotions a bit more. And you know, you've been following me for a fair while. We've been talking for a little while, and you know how high the level the content I like to put out is. It's, you know, it's very scientific and very nuanced.
Very different to most people in the
Yeah,
but most
you know,
people in your space don't have your background either. So
they don't. And you know, when I first qualified, I guess you could say certified from the Oxygen Advantage, I felt like I had to speak to that because that was like the industry standard. And then I started to realize, like, actually, I don't really agree with some of the science in here. Like, it's actually really pretty lame and pretty poor. And so I started to have my own opinion. And then when I started to have my own opinion, I started to get people to say, "Hey, look, you seem like you know what you're on about. Will you mentor me?" And initially I was like, not sure whether I'm in that position to mentor people just yet. But they had like 4 or 5 people reach out to me in the space of like about a month. And so I just said yes and said, "Hey, look, here's 12 modules I think I can teach. Now I can do the breathing mechanics. I can do the biochemistry and the CO₂. I can talk about the nervous system. I can talk about breathing behavior and emotions. I can talk about exercise and physiology and cold and heat exposure and sleep and the psychology of it all," and just built this program. And before I knew it, like, I had 44 people one-on-one signed up. I was lecturing 5 hours a day, like 4 days a week, nearly burnt out. And then I decided to go to a group cohort, and I didn't think it would work because of the depth of the science, but it's worked out. And, you know, now you've probably followed along. I now have the School of Breath Science. And so got a community of practitioners all around the world, and, you know, joining us every month or every couple of weeks, every week. In fact, I do stuff in there for breath sessions or journal club or, you know, Q&As or revision sessions. And then we have obviously our 7 to 9 of course as well.
Yeah, so pretty spectacular. I've been researching some graduate courses that might appeal to me, and there's nothing that actually comes close to the depth that you managed to cover in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well
it
done.
Really
it's
is.
really cool to see the success.
I would say it's, you know, it's at least graduate level, if not postgraduate level in some spaces, because people always ask me, like, why'd you go into so much depth? It's like, because I'm trying to show you where I don't believe other people have it right in the industry. It's like, I can't just give you like a little bit of evidence and connect a little dots. I've got to show you the full picture. And if you're a scientist, you've got to be detailed and thorough. And so people are like, whoa, you really like to go into the details. I'm like, yeah, of course I do. That's what matters.
Yeah. How do you think that the courses that you've put together and your experience might benefit free divers? Because I think free diving is kind of at this tipping point now where it's becoming more scientific, and it's used to be very yoga oriented, and it's kind of moving into the modern age now.
Yeah. Well, I've got plenty of free divers on there, and they've all felt it was like it's been a huge benefit. Obviously, you know Phil yourself. I've got a guy called Daniel Drost, who's also a free dive instructor as well. Free diving, whilst the main thing is obviously relaxation, being able to hold your breath, and being able to manage the fear of being in deep ocean, and there's lots to it. But at the end of the day, you're working with a human and an athlete, and therefore to get that person to their best, you want to look at their nervous system. You want to look at their sleep. You want to be able to look at like how they can regulate their emotions and understand that, how the psychology relates to, their breathing and their breath holds, and really holistically. And then also I teach like how to actually facilitate like coaching, like how to structure programs and how to assess people and how to understand the nuances. And so I do see that my course is a huge benefit to freedivers, and particularly freedive instructors who want to kind of level up to the next step and just go, look, I actually really want to feel like I'm an expert and confident in this. Because I do imagine that a lot of them go towards oxygen advantage, and that is, it's very Buteyko based, and Buteyko is like 1930 or 1940 or whatever it was, and it's outdated, and there's a few marketed things in there that I don't particularly believe in. So some of the nuance changes the framing and way that you would practice some of the practices in freediving, I would imagine, but also at the same time not, because you have drawn from yoga. And the yogis, in the science, we're starting to understand that the yogis had it right. They've got it right. But, traditional yoga, not modern day yoga, which is more about movement and entertainment.
It's a different kind of science, but very experiential, I'm guessing. Like, none of us were alive back then. But they were obviously onto something. And it's not really surprising that elements of it, at least, are being shown to be correct in modern science. And I think this leads us on quite nicely, actually. So you've talked about some of the other schools of breath work and the kind of trends that are prevalent at the moment. From your perspective, how credible do you think the breath science is now?
I mean, if you actually look at the literature and you dive into scientific literature, you can see a massive growth in just the science of breathing is exponentially growing at the moment because of the interest in breath work and breathing over the last 5 years. All it takes is an 18, 19-year-old person to get into breath work or free diving or something and then go, I've got an interest in that now. Then they go to university and then they do a master's and then they eventually do a PhD. And that's how we see the trends kind of growing. I would say that, I don't think there is anyone that really competes with what I do, where I'm sat in almost like the wellness space and trying to be someone who sits between the academia and the breath industry or the wellness industry and the performance industry and mediates kind of like the language and tries to connect those things together. But I don't come from a position of using a technique or a method or try to sell something through marketing of like a particular brand. Like, of course I have a brand, but my brand is about science. And so I do have to keep myself updated. And that's why I have my community, because every month I literally break down a new journal. I would do a new lecture every 3 or 4 months to try and keep on top of it. And every 3 years I have to redo my course. And so, because my knowledge updates.
Yeah.
So traditionally...
And the science is changing quite quickly as well, as you said before. Yeah.
Exactly. So to keep on top of it, I've got to be reading almost every single day. Thank God there's tools with AI where you can break things down a little bit faster now. But it's insane how much literature is coming out nowadays in this space, but also the things that are linked to this space as well. And how you can then, I see myself as a scientist, but also a little bit of a creative, because I like the idea of connecting dots and like creating and seeing patterns. And being quite open to, that fits with that, and this then drawing the picture kind of like as the, looking at the larger rather than just looking at the details, but how does that connect to the larger picture as well?
Yeah, if anyone who's listening hasn't seen Martin's communication on Instagram, then I'll drop the IG profile down below.
Thank you.
In the comments. And I think what caught my eye from some of the initial communication that I saw a year or two ago was exactly what you've described. And you put out some communication a few weeks later, you'd reviewed a new study, and it almost contradicted something that you'd said. And I could see that you were just totally open to reviewing your opinions. And a lot of the other schools of breath work have not, that's probably not the correct term, but some of the other industry standards in breath work have almost doubled down on what they've said rather than being open to change.
Yeah,
very refreshing.
When you have a method that's sold off a principle or a mechanism that perhaps is now being challenged, like how do you rebrand what you're talking about? Like that's the problem that I see when you have like a method, is that method, whilst yes, it can work, and I'm not saying that other people's practices don't work, but if you're saying you're science-based, you have to also align with what the scientific truth or what the latest scientific truth suggests. And so that's why, I'm constantly going to have to keep on evolving. And which also helps and supports because that means I've got more people that want to stay with me because they want to keep learning. They want to keep evolving and growing.
Yeah. Okay, so it works to your advantage. I also wanted just briefly to, with the rise of social media and artificial intelligence, everyone's a researcher, and I'm probably guilty of that myself. But I'm always hopefully fairly transparent that what I say is just what I've discovered for the time, and I'm totally open to changing my mind. Do you think there's a danger that people are getting flooded with incorrect messages because of their ability just to post stuff online?
Definitely, because artificial intelligence, like without kind of being big-headed, I can outsmart artificial intelligence easily. Like, for someone who's been researching for 15 years into a one direction is smarter than your standard chat TTP to a certain extent. I get to a point where it just agrees with me and I'm like, that wasn't what I wanted at all.
Yeah.
And so there is a bias to these things and to AI, and especially the way that they're created is that, of course, you can get a journal and you could copy paste it and you could put it into there and you could say, make me some content from this, but it doesn't create the ability to critically think through a methodology, to look at results and see the patterns in different results in the paper and go, I don't actually agree with what that author's put in there. That's what training is, getting your academic skills and I have a master's in research and a master's in science and have been reading this stuff for a long time. And I can't do that because that's the process of like your knowledge or my knowledge, like having a different opinion to what that person thinks in there. Of course, what I can do is I can then go, right, this is what I think. This is what this person thinks. Like what of this paper, what evidence is there to suggest that actually what I'm saying has more weight or what that person's saying. And you can have a dialogue with it, but you need to know what questions to ask and you need to know what points to make. And unless you have a background, you can't do that. The issue is that social media doesn't know that. The social media, people on social media don't know that I'm doing that. Yeah, they just probably see it and go, oh, that person's just reading a paper and sharing a paper.
Yeah. So I guess consistency is probably the key to showing people that you're more than just the typical social media person who's regurgitating viewpoints.
Just stay authentic. I think the future of social media is those who stay authentic will be the individuals who people connect to, and those who just decide, let's just make it all about AI. People will be like, yeah. There's actually, interesting enough, I can't remember who it was, but I was watching something the other day and it was talking about children and videos on AI on social media and how when they notice children, like, age 9 to 10, when they see it's AI, they skip past it. They're not bothered.
Okay.
They're not bothered about it.
We're seeing, I was explaining earlier that I'm a teacher in a school, international school here in Singapore, and we're actually seeing the same thing happening now. Kids are asking to have phones put away, whereas a year ago or 2 years ago, we were struggling to get people off the screens. That's obviously still a problem, but I think they're starting to realize now that real interaction is not on screen, and I think they're smarter than we are probably when it comes to identifying AI and all these digital tricks that they've brought up with. Okay, right. So recently we've been doing a little bit of a dive on CO₂, we being me, and that's my interest in speaking to you because I know that you've come at that from a different angle to my lens of freediving. The first thing that I was surprised to hear was urge to breathe and contractions, which are terms we use in freediving, aren't all that common in the literature and in other fields. So how would you talk about these things?
Yeah, I mean, in the literature, the urge to breathe will be described as air hunger mostly. That's probably the language that you're going to be looking at. And, the urge to breathe has a sensory component, which is like that physical need to breathe, like the actual movement. And that's like the diaphragm contractions that you start to, appear. But there's an emotional component to it. There's an affective emotional component where you have a psychological desire, like, hey, like I feel panicky right now. And so the way that I would describe those two things is, yes, it's like we're looking at air hunger as the whole thing, but we're looking at both a sensory component and an emotional component within that word. And what you would describe that as is the need to make physical movement in your breathing, which is your diaphragm starting to contract. And then, of course, that fear that starts to come in the mind that people associate with CO₂ tolerance.
I wonder why we've adopted this term urge to breathe instead of air hunger. Air hunger seems kind of nicer in some ways, actually. It's a hunger is something that that we're used to. It's something familiar and something that we can come to get used to as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that term itself has come from people who get breathlessness from disease state or dysfunctional breathing. They often say, "I can't get enough air. I feel I can't get enough air." That's like one of the sayings that is very, very common. So then, of course, someone would go, "Well, it sounds like you've got a hunger for air
Yeah,
hunger."
makes sense. Yeah. Uh, plain speak. Okay, so you've touched a little bit on where that derives from. There's a physical component and there's an affective component, I think was the word that you used.
Mm.
Could you break that down a little bit more? Like, what are the processes that are in place? The physical ones to start with, maybe.
Yeah. So first of all, physically, we always have part of our brain, in our brain stem, in our medulla oblongata, called the pre-Botzinger complex. And that is something that is generating the inspiratory pattern of our breathing. You could call it our unconscious tonic breathing. So when we're not paying attention to our breath, of course, we still breathe. And that's because it's just on a rhythm. It's on a pattern, right? And that doesn't require CO2. It doesn't require oxygen. It can actually, it's just like you're in your heart, you have a sinusoidal node. It's a self-generating electrical impulse, which in traditional language, they might call that chi or chai, or,
Okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
interesting when you start to think about that. That's always happening. Even when we decide, right, I'm going to voluntarily override that and control my breath. What then happens is the motor cortex of our brain then bypasses that. And then we obviously control the breathing muscles. However, that pattern generator is still firing. Okay. And so whilst you might think you're holding your breath, you're overriding it, but eventually that pattern's going to start sending deeper impulses, okay, faster impulses. Now that will be as a result of, CO2 starting to rise. Okay. That will be a trigger to start to induce that movement and to increase the frequency or the you could say the drive of those contractions. Eventually they manage to get through. And so obviously that's the easy phase with no contractions. Then the hard phase is when that pre-Botzinger complex says like, hey, we've had enough now. We're just going to start to really drive impulses down your phrenic nerve into your diaphragm. We're going to make it contract. The other aspect of it is the change in, so affect, if you consider what the concept of affect, the body affecting and priming the mind, through emotion, through feelings, we have, if you think of a circle, we have arousal, high arousal, low arousal. You have pleasant and unpleasant. And that is the mood of the body without the meaning attached to it. The emotion is the meaning that we give to something. So if we were to describe right now how I'm feeling, I'm probably on a more aroused state because I'm talking, I'm engaged. I'm probably more on the pleasant side because I'm enjoying this conversation. But when you hold your breath, well, initially, you're kind of content and you're calm, unless you have something like panic or anxiety disorder, or you're fearful of holding your breath. But that easy phase doesn't really change your affect too much. But then you start to notice the arousal start creeping up. And then you start to notice the unpleasant sensations. And all of a sudden what you have is, well, high arousal, unpleasant. You have anxiety. Yeah. And so in terms of the sensation, it's microdosing anxiety. It's why I use breath holds in people who have a history of anxiety down the road, because it's like, cool, we can just use a bit of fear through breath holding and we can microdose on that and we can desensitize to those sensations. Now, I guess one of the main questions that you're here for is my distinguishing between CO2 tolerance and air hunger tolerance and what's going on there, and why I necessarily don't believe it's the CO2 itself. Okay. Now, the way that I want to think about this is imagine CO2 is the fuel, right? And the nervous system's the spark. And then the air hunger is the flame. What do you get burnt by?
The flame.
The flame, right? Okay. And so what would the flame be in terms of the mechanism of creating that flame? Well, this is the concept of what we call signal to noise ratio in our brain. So we have the chemoreceptors, peripheral, central chemoreceptors in our peripheral ones in our carotid bodies and our aorta. They are detecting changes in blood pH and CO2 levels. If we hold our breath, of course, CO2 rises. Now, what that typically does, it sends a signal to the brainstem to try and breathe, but we're overriding that. And so the brain is saying, hold on a second, we didn't anticipate that this was going to happen because it's irregular to hold your breath. So then it sends a signal in a different direction. And that direction is through a small little tunnel called the nucleus tract solitarius at the base of the brain. And that fires information into what we call the salient parts, a salient network. Salience means making you aware, bringing your attention to something. So essentially, there's a signal that forces through to the brain to make you aware of your breathing, to bring it into conscious awareness, because now you're at a point where this is critical to pH and critical to survival, that we need to create a sensation to change your behavior.
This thing that we're calling urge to breathe or air hunger really is just attention. It's suddenly something's come to our attention.
It's like all of a sudden your brain has said, now you need to pay attention to this information because what we did earlier didn't work. The holding the breath and trying to make you breathe again, like unconsciously, you're not doing that. You've overridden it. You've created what we call a prediction error in our nervous system. The nervous system didn't anticipate it was going to happen. And so when there is a prediction error, there's two things that can happen. Well, number one, you change your behavior. So that would be to recommence breathing. Or number two, you have an update in perception, which is creating anxiety. Okay. Now, what governs how much of this information goes through into the salient network and then goes from the salient network, which is kind of the midbrain, into your frontal cortex so that you recognize it, but also into your amygdala that creates fear, depends on the amplitude of the signal that comes through, is simply your arousal, how much sympathetic tone you have and how much noradrenaline you have in your system. That's modulating what we call the gain. Now imagine you've got an individual who plays guitar. When you play an acoustic guitar and it's all mellow and it's Spanish, you kind of hear every note, it's soft, and like, that's okay. But then all of a sudden you turn up a guitar and turn the gain up, and it's just like a rock guitar. Well, that's the difference between someone having a signal going for their brain and being okay and stay regulated, so someone then having a signal going for their brain and going, whoa, panic attack. Yeah. So it's gain modulation, and that is then controlled top down. It's called cortical modulation by our frontal cortex. And so the actual experiential change that we have at least initially, I don't know whether it's all of it. I don't know how much comes into the chemoreceptors. I'm going to kind of talk through this a little bit more. But if we've got greater modulation of this middle part of our brain and it reduces the gain in the system, then less signal comes through and therefore less salient and therefore less we have to pay attention to it. It's called desensitization or habituation.
Okay.
So it's psychological.
So when we're talking about adaptation in terms of freediving and CO₂ tolerance, then what we're really talking about is turning the gain down. I love these analogies.
Turning the gain down.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And this is not even an analogy. This is the language they use in computational and neuroscience nowadays. Yeah. It's the way that the brain works, the way to look at the brain works. And so we have, the term gain is literally amplifying a signal that comes through to the mind, just like music would do. And so, we are the frontal cortex is then kind of regulating that gain controller. And then picture this. Do you remember the old tape recorders where you used to have to press pause and record together to record like what's going on in that moment?
Yeah, I'm sure that 80% of the people that are watching this won't remember those, but yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I remember having a double tape deck to be able to copy them across as well. Pass tapes on to friends,
So the way that I look at CO₂ is when CO₂ starts to rise and it starts to go towards outside of homeostasis, it almost presses play and record at the same time, and then records what goes on consciously, and records what goes on emotionally, and records what goes on physically. And then it imprints that as into your perception. Okay. And so I talked earlier, there's only two things that can happen when there's a prediction error: change your behavior or update your perception. Well, the first thing you can experience is anxiety or fear. But if you learn to microdose on that by gradually exposing yourself in a safe manner, that is, we'd call it within your window of tolerance or your window of performance, that's just enough to push you past the edge, but to tell your brain it's safe, well, that desensitizes it. That records that your perception can change and it no longer needs to be salient in the mind. It no longer needs to bring into awareness, and therefore it can stay in your unconscious. And so you can get significant adaptation within weeks or two from simply just teaching people that they're safe when they hold their breath. Even when you teach one session in freediving, you can get people from a 30-second breath hold to a minute breath hold or a minute half breath hold in like 3 breath holds. Well, of course, well, that's not going to be a chemoreceptor that's all of a sudden dampening down, because then that person's going to leave and then not be able to breathe properly.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, because their body would suddenly not feel any ventilatory response. Is that the right term? Yes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen. Even to people who are doing crazy volume of breath holds, that doesn't happen. They continue to breathe, right?
Yeah. And so the urge to breathe, whilst CO2 is the fuel, it's not the thing that is causing the scarring or the change. It's your relationship to a sensation. And therefore, it's so much more psychological than it is physiological. Of course, it has physiological effects. Now, the other thing that you can kind of look at is there's some new literature that came out by a guy called Andrea Nicolo in the University of Rome. And what he did is he looked at what happens when someone has cold shock and they get in an ice bath, what happens to their breathing? Well, initially there's a gasp, and then there's a hyperventilation, and then eventually the hyperventilation goes down and the person starts to breathe a little bit deeper. There was a guy called Mike Tipson, who is an environmental physiologist, who broke this down. He said, well, initially the gasp is a reflex that gets in the water. Then we have this hyperventilation, which is a sympathetic response, a shock response. And then when the person starts to shiver and they increase metabolic activity, we increase CO2, and that increases the depth of breathing to clear CO2 out and to bring O2 in. And so this Andrea Nicolo guy said, well, I wonder whether that's the same during exercise. And so he did like 4 or 5 different studies, and he started to say that actually it seems as though your rate of breathing is more impacted by stresses beyond metabolism, cognition, emotion, cold, heat, anything that's not related to a metabolism. But CO2 seems to kind of titrate your depth of breathing as you're resting and when you're exercising, to fine tune as a feedback system. Now, when you look at people who do air hunger tolerance training or CO2 tolerance training or nasal breathing during exercise, the thing that improves the most is you see a reduction in respiratory rate. You don't really see people all of a sudden getting like really shallow or low tidal volume. And so that for me suggests it's non-metabolic, and therefore it's more behavioral, and we'd call it a feed-forward system. And so that is when the prediction error creates that update in perception. Well, no longer now do we have that affective drive of air hunger when we nasal breathe or when we hold our breath. And therefore that doesn't drive respiratory rate more, which is what the behavior would typically be, because the breath doesn't become salient and the affect of that breath doesn't become high arousal. Okay. Follow that? I know that was a bit of a...
No, it's great. I'm probably going to have to rewatch this whole interview at the end, but I'm following it. So I've got like a million questions to unpack the things that you've just said, but I guess one of the key ones is if we generally agree that it's more the conscious or salient part of the brain that's responsible for air hunger, or at least the part that we can lure into adapting and as freedivers getting used to the sensations, and less about the physiological chemoreceptor brainstem part of the response, then what is the correct dosage that we should be subjecting our you've said you've used the term microdosing, but I mean, what does that mean in practical terms?
The easiest way for me to explain it is that if you become reactive, then you've gone too far. And so if there is what I call a defensive behavior starting to kick in, if you get tension, you get worry and concern, and you get, obviously a shift in your behavior, you start to fin faster or you start to change your behavior, you've gone too far. Yeah.
So we want to be kind of at that point.
You kind of want
that response is just about to emerge, but not quite.
Lean into that edge and then teaching your brain, okay, right. If you can notice it and recognize it mindfully, and then you can kind of learn to be able to, okay, let go, that's fine. But as soon as you start to show a behavior where you're no longer consciously driving it, you've gone too far.
Okay.
In my opinion.
I'm starting to see the connections, and you've mentioned some other sports in the last 5 minutes. I'm starting to see connections between what we do in terms of apnea training and endurance sports in particular. And just making a link with what you've just said, most cyclists or long distance swimmers or runners are kind of at about 70 to 80% zone 2, which in other sports would be measured as lactate and millimoles. But in our terms, I think there's a good analogy there as well. Do you think it makes sense that we should be aiming for like 70 to 80% in that region you've just described, where we're just kind of leaning in, but we're not actually having a reaction.
Yeah, that's exactly where I often will between 0 and 10. I use, rating of perceived exertion is something that we would typically, like when we're exercising, how hard do I feel this exercise is? I basically use that for air hunger. Your rating of perceived exertion subjectively on a scale of 0 to 10. And I say, well, initially, if I've got someone with anxiety, I only go to a 4 or a 5. And I don't go there until I've got them more grounded and regulated and feeling calm and being able to, feel more relaxed. But for people who want to do freediving, like you start to push to 6 to 7, to 8. And then that's how I would then use it as an embodied practice. Because if you give people goals and external factors, you get someone who's got a performance mindset, they'll just push to that number or depth or speed or whatever it is, regardless of sensations, to perform. They'll disconnect.
Yeah.
Now that can come, that's fine if you are trying to get your world record or your national record. Yeah. Disconnecting and going into a space where you're avoiding sensation, but you don't want to be doing that all the time, because that's not true habituation or true desensitization. That's a technique to allow you to disconnect to perform. And so that's not going to create adaptation.
Yeah. So
yeah,
I'm guessing that's mostly motivation, usually extrinsic, right? If you're willing to push to that level, then, and that's never going to be a long-term solution.
It can be intrinsic as well, I'd call it willpower, which, motivation and desire to succeed would be willpower.
So longer term gains in an adaptation will probably be more in the lower end of the RPE scale.
Yeah. Let's say if you've got a cycle of 8 weeks of training and you're going to introduce yourself and you go, right, let's just go to 5. Okay, we'll go to 5 and then we'll do, let's say you're doing just, rather than doing depth, you're just doing underwater. I'm just going to go to the point where I get to 5. And then I'm going to do that in the first session. And then the second session, I'm going to maybe aim for the second and third session that week, I'm going to aim for a 6 or a 7. And then the following week, I'm going to go for, stick to a 7. And the week after that, I'm going to go to an 8. And then I might just give myself a little bit of a break. I might come back down to a 7 again. And then I might try and see, then I'll record the distances and then see, okay, well, now is my 8 now a 6? Yeah, the distance I got to at an 8, is that now become a 6? If so, I can then probably go a little bit further in my distance and push an 8 ball. And then every now and then I might go, right, just once in a blue moon, let's just do a 10. Let's just push a 9 or a 10 and just see how far I can get. And then that will change what your 6 and your 7 are, probably down to 4s anyway, because you'll realize mentally, I went much further I can, if you're able to succeed. If not, obviously your perception will get updated to a failure and you'll go, right, maybe I'm not, and you'll lose confidence.
Yeah. Okay. This all makes total sense. And I think from experience, a number of us who are kind of in the intermediate to more elite range of apnea sports find the same thing. And I know from personal experience, if I push right to the limit more than a couple of times, maybe over the course of a week or something like that, then I'm done. My nervous system will then reject, and I'm not even able to get to 50 or 60%. I have to down-regulate.
Well, what you've all of a sudden, then you've created a bigger spark, so the flame gets increased, right? And so your cortical modulation reduces, so you get an increase in gain. Yeah. And that's typically when someone's overtrained or overexposed themselves, and they've then sensitized themselves rather than desensitized themselves. And then you've got work to do again. You've got to kind of go back to relaxation and downregulation and recovery, and then you've got to rebuild. Now, of course, if that happens every now and then, that's fine. But if you're trying to push that all the time, you're not going to make as much progress. And in fact, you're even going to potentially do harm to your physical health.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that. So overtraining can increase the gain in a way that is negative or unwanted. Yeah. What other things in our lives could also increase the gain that might affect
caffeine intake? Tolerance? Caffeine intake. Yeah.
Okay.
No one likes it when I say that. Your sleep habits, your circadian rhythm flows, the amount of screen time you have, like the things like loud music and stuff like that. Obviously partying and alcohol and stuff, like anything that is gonna spark arousal in a system, really. Yeah, because that's what we're looking at.
And I guess they all affect each other as well. So my overtraining in freediving could then affect other parts of my life as well, where I need to.
100%. Yeah, I was working with a freediver not too long ago. And, he came to me with anxiety issues and issues related to stress. And we started to work on the things that are around his freediving in terms of what he's doing in the gym and reducing intensity in the gym. We started to look at his relationship with his wife and how he could be more regulated and all that sort of stuff. And as he was doing that, his freediving training was getting better, because you can't just look at, okay, I'm just training and I'm not training. It's the whole system. Allostatic load would be the correct term that we would use. So the accumulation of all the stresses in someone's life, biopsychosocial, even spiritual, if people are there, on all of those planes. And so you've got to look at all of them. And that's what I think, my training tends to offer more than maybe just like learning free diving. It's like, it looks at all those things around your life that can contribute to stress that might not necessarily be the specific stressors such as training.
Yeah, this is a message that's really typically absent from most instructor courses in freediving. So it's kind of inconvenient knowing that you have to take care of all this, but it's also exciting. It gives me hope that there's other avenues towards training that haven't been that explored yet.
Of course. Well, if you can be a freedive instructor, but then expand your ability to also be able to help someone in their life around kind of just general stress, resilience, nervous system, breathing, etc., etc. It just expands your capacity to help that individual, but also potentially get clients that are not freedivers that you can help with anxiety and stress as well.
Yeah.
We're all humans, so treating people like humans, and I often work with athletes, but I look at them as a human. If an athlete comes to me and they're anxious and stressed, I'm not treating that person as an athlete. I'm treating that person as an anxious or stressed human.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, and I've got so many more things to ask. So I'm gonna fire away a couple more questions. One thing that I notice as new freedivers are coming and training with me is how much variation there is in between them, especially when it comes to their ability to tolerate CO₂. I'm wondering if you have any good explanations for this. I've got a friend who just started freediving about a year ago. He on day one he held his breath for 5 minutes, and that's seemed to me impossible, an impossible feat. But I'm seeing more and more people like this, and then others, after years of training, are still getting horrible air hunger at 1 or 2 minutes into their breath hold. What's the difference?
I would say that the most significant difference is going to be vital capacity, or total lung capacity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, especially if you're doing inhale hold, and that's how you're assessing someone's CO₂ tolerance via inhale hold. So, I naturally have about a 3.5 minute, 4 minute breath hold, but I have a 7 liter. I have 8 liter lungs.
Okay.
Yeah, my VC is about
That's
about
exceptional.
6.8,
liter and a half
6.7.
more than standard. Yeah.
And I'm not 6'7". I'm not. I'm bang on 6 foot, so I'm not massively tall. But typically, taller people should be able to have a longer breath hold because they've got greater VC, vital capacity. Interestingly enough, though, when it comes to breath holds, again, it's like the thing that actually sends signals to the brain to let us know whether we're safe or not is stretch receptors. It's actually diaphragm tension and stretch that's more of a signal to the brain to tell the brain that we're under a threat than it is CO₂ rising, as well as the amplification of the signal. So the sensational, mechanical wise, I know you guys do a lot of stretching and diaphragm work and stuff like that. Hey, not only is that going to help you with your RV at depth and and issues related to coming back up and pneumothorax, but also it's generally teaching those stretch receptors that you're safe when you have stretched lungs.
That you're safe. Do you think so? And for a beginner, it's very, very rare for anyone to be able to hold their breath to hypoxia. It's the CO₂ that becomes
they
the issue first.
haven't got the air hunger tolerance to get into hypoxia initially. Yeah.
So those who seem naturally able to just push through, do you think there's differences in how those stretch receptors, among others, are?
Well, there's going to be that. There's going to be that.
Apnea?
You're going to have psychological barriers there in terms of like, okay, if you've got a macho person who could just knows like, hey, this is just a unpleasant sensation and it can just push through and push through discomfort, of course they're going to have better, you could call that stress resilience if you wanted to, compared to someone who maybe comes in and they're quite timid and they have a soft personality and they like the ocean and really want to get into free diving, but they're also a little bit nervous and anxious. But then you've got someone who's 6'7" and comes in and goes, oh yeah, I love this shit. Like, I want to do breath holds because I want to get better at being hard with breath holds. Just that, and I know that's not how you do free diving, but that in itself is going to have a massive discrepancy in terms of someone's ability to hold.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm looking for explanations. This friend that I was just talking about, he's now at 8.5 minutes. He's got a continental record, and I'm like, how is that possible after a year and a half?
There,
But yeah,
there,
his
there,
VC
there
for
will,
sure.
there's going to be outliers that are always going to have, perhaps this guy's, just naturally got a low level of gain in his system. I don't know him, but personality wise, is he more of a chilled out person, more kind of regulated?
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he is.
History of a good aerobic capacity, potentially like healthy mitochondria. The mitochondria are not going to start to struggle when they're going hypoxic, and they can actually continue to produce aerobic respiration for longer. There's so much to it that would be hard to say this person's just that, but I would say it's probably because they've got good willpower. They've probably got pretty chilled in general, and they've probably got a large title.
Yeah. Okay. You're right. And this particular person, you're right on all counts. But there are still some mysteries. There's a lot that's I don't understand. The person I train with the most is a friend of mine called Patricia. Hi, Pat. Her VC's small. She's very petite, and yet she can hold her breath for 7 minutes and has just a whole bunch of national records. And I think there's a whole combination of things that are coming together to.
Yeah, so I mean, things like your resting metabolic rate is going to be significant there as well, because at the end of the day, when you're starting to push longer breath holds, like the main thing that does matter then is hypoxia. Yeah, and it's like your low O2 tolerance, which is going to be related to how relaxed and how low can you get your metabolism, and how well can you get that reflex to kick in so that reduces your metabolism. And so perhaps there's some people who just have naturally better mammalian dive reflex than other people.
Okay, look, I've had you for nearly an hour already. I'm really, really grateful for this. I think it's going to be super enlightening to most of the people who follow me. I mean, I'm not a social media star or anything, but there's a lot of keen freedivers who will be listening in. And is there anything that you could tell people about your course, or how to contact you, perhaps, if they were interested in learning more from you?
Yeah, of course. You can follow me on my social media, Martin McPhilimey. But if you want to check out what my school is about, even if it's just joining the community for free and joining for breath sessions, checking out the resources and blogs, you can go on schoolofbreathscience.com. I do have a paid tier, and so it probably works out about £35 a month, and you get access to a load of lectures and workshops and me breaking down the scientific nuance. And every month I break down a new journal live with people. We do breath sessions. It's all recorded in there, and so that's available. And then of course there's a 7 to 9 month breath science certification where I actually train people in all of this, as well as sleep, as well as emotions, nervous system, psychology, how to coach people, how to assess people, etc., etc. And so that course is breathscience.com.au, and just submit an application. Let me know that you've come from this podcast, and and that you're a freediver, and I will do my best to explain and show you how it can level up your skills.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I know I said that was the last question, but now I just want to know, how do you do so much? How do you produce so much, read so much, create all the content that you do, as well as actually working on your courses?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to remember, me reading a scientific paper, I've been doing it for 15 years, 16 years. And so when I read a scientific paper, I can kind of skim read a lot of it now and then go, right, okay, I can take this and put it into, I've got templates that I've been working on. I've been posting on social media since 2018. So 7 years. And so I've got templates. I've got things where I've just got workplaces. I've just got, habits that I've just got into place of doing it. And I also have a VA that helps me now as well. And so I've got a VA who's repurposing some of my old content, and just kind of using that on the School of Breath Science. And so you've probably seen that there's mine and then the School of Breath Science. And my VA is just basically repurposing a lot of my old stuff, and it's really helped me with that. Just because I'm at a point now where I've got to build a team. It's been a one-man band for a while, but now I've got to build a team, because I want to build a business and not be a one-man band.
You're about as efficient as you can be with just one person.
Yeah, one person, and I've got an 18-month-old baby now. So, 18 months ago, a little girl called Lanny came into my life, and my wife, and I've got to give them more attention. And I don't want to be the person who just works all the time. I want to be present, and so that's been an interesting journey to navigate. But yeah, we'll leave that there.
Okay, that was more of a personal question, but I think I'll leave it in.
Yeah,
thanks.
It's just habits and consistency.
Empty lungs completely, packed them to the brim. Now the clock starts ticking.